to get started. I know other people will be coming in. On behalf of the Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice, the Women's March of Sussex, and the Seaside Jewish community, I want to welcome you to this evening's event, a presentation and discussion on racism and anti-Semitism. By the way, my name is Charlotte King, and I'm the chair of the Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice. I've always been This event was planned out of our shared grief over the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, over anti-Semitic rhetoric coming from the National Women's Movement leadership, and the ongoing racism within our criminal justice and education systems. Let me take a moment before I continue to introduce two dignitaries. Stacy Burton is here representing the governor's office. Stacy. And Diaz Bonville is here representing Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester. Now, since I always make a mistake, I've got other dignitaries here that sneaked in without me seeing them. We invited our legislators at the state and county level. Robin DiAngelo, an author of White Fragility, which has been on the New York bestseller list for the past 7 months, asked the question, if no one is racist, why is racism still America's biggest problem? In a New York Times article on growing anti-Semitism, Deborah Lipstadt, a professor of Holocaust history at Emory University in Atlanta, is referenced for likening anti-Semitism to a herpes infection that lies dormant and reemerges at times of stress. And I think we can agree this is a very stressful time in all of our lives. The Anti-Defamation League logged a 57% rise in anti-Semitic incidences in 2017 compared to the previous year, the highest in any year that they have been tracking it. We are encouraged by your willingness to participate in this public dialogue of these two seemingly chronic malignancies that remain in stage 4. While we recognize the tragic existence of other societal malignancies such as homophobia and Islamophobia, our focus tonight is on racism and anti-Semitism, which have much in common. They are both designed to foster false beliefs such as a collective inferiority and criminality. They are both governed by hate and violence rather than the curative power of love. I'm going to turn the meeting over because you didn't come to hear me, you came to hear our esteemed speakers. So I'm going to turn the meeting over to Gwendolyn Miller, our moderator, who will introduce our speakers and who herself runs an organization that hopefully will deal with racism and anti-Semitism. She'll tell you more about that. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Charlotte. It is my pleasure to be here tonight and serve as the moderator for Racism and Anti-Semitism, an action dialogue program. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for coming out to hear this program. Please allow me to say a few words about our first speaker, Dr. James Newton. Dr. James E. Newton was a University of Delaware professor of Black American Studies, retired from his full-time faculty position in 2005 after a 33-year career. Besides his teaching duties, Newton directed what is now the Department of Black American Studies, acted as chair of the Commission to Promote Racial and Cultural Diversity, and served as a member of the United States Commission on Civil Rights Delaware State Advisory Committee. His commitment to the communities Service includes membership on the boards of Walnut Street YMCA, Delaware State Arts Council, Delaware Art Museum, and the YMCA of Delaware and Public Allies. In 2012, Dr. Newton was named winner of the James H. Gilman Sr. Chairman's Award by the Metropolitan Wilmington Urban League. The award recognizes pioneers for outstanding contributions and leadership in the fight for civil rights and a more equal and inclusive America. Newton was the first African American to earn a master's degree in fine arts at the University of North Carolina and received his doctorate from Illinois State University. He is the author of The Principles of Diversity, Handbook for a Diversity-Friendly America, and of a curriculum evaluation on student knowledge of Afro-American life and history. He is also the co-editor, The Other Slaves, Mechanics, Artisans, and Craftsmen, and he has won first prize awards in sculpture and graphics in the National African American Art Exhibit in Atlanta. Please give a warm welcome to a multifaceted, multi-talented man, Dr. James Newton.
Thank you. I'll respond by what my father said, that I'm just a little black boy from Richmond, New Jersey. My topic, and I thank the organizations for inviting me here today. I'm one of those people who talk and don't know when to stop talking. I was trained and educated by mostly German refugees fleeing the Third Reich under Adolf Hitler. They taught me German, art, and philosophy. Ich bin, du bist, sie ist. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. They were my mentors, and they learned something about Black-Jewish relations. But my general topic ended up being the history of blacks in American society. And I began to thrive on it. And here I am today expecting that, what is the history of racism? And I don't have the time to spread it all out, but there are various interpretations. My interpretation is clear and simple. Racism, the roots of racism are in slavery. The roots of racism are within the realm of slavery. Although slavery was throughout the world hemispheres, black and white slaves, slaves from all kinds of other countries, it was the Atlantic slave trade that really began to perpetuate the idea of inferiority and inequality. The various countries who were involved with the enslavement process sought labor in the American hemisphere. They sought for others to do the work that they sought not to do. The result is that all of a sudden we're at the Atlantic slave trade. Countries bringing goods from Europe to Africa, picking up African cargo, creating what we call the Middle Passage from Africa to the New World, the Bahamas, the West Indies, and the Americas, and then going back to the same process called the triangular slave trade. This was the entrance in not only greed, but also in the idea that the economy is going to be based on somebody else's labor. The economies were going to be based on someone else's labor. So what we end up with is, in this hemisphere, that I had several things that brought my attention to that the biggest amount of slaves, they think now it was at least 12 million. Before the record was about 10 million slaves were brought to the New World. Now we're talking about 12 million. A lot of people don't know that 3.5 million slaves were brought to Brazil. The next in line was the British colonies. Long save the Queen. America only had about 300 or 400,000 slaves that were bought here. We were one of the lowest next to the Danish colonies. So American slavery became the epitome of not just greed, but also a sense of non-brotherhood. The feeling that somebody else has to do your work. Some of you have heard of Prince Henry of Portugal. Prince Henry didn't go around to the west coast of Africa to penetrate the coast and to take about 8 African boys back to Portugal and put them on the auction block. What happened was the Portuguese began the slave trade. The result of it is, once we came to the New World, we had to be distinguishing as to what was going to happen to us. The question to many slaves was probably, who am I and what? Ended up in this America. We can highlight several elements that took place. One, the original slave trade in America, and then we can talk about the preemptive elements of the Civil War. A lot of people don't know that the Civil War was really the test for brotherhood. Some people were for it, some were against it. This Civil War erupted, and a brooding president called Abraham Lincoln had to sit there and try to figure out what was he going to do with the slave population. The result being that Lincoln, in 1863, had to emancipate the slaves. This emancipation, in 1863, Lincoln had told others that what will happen to our ancestors 100 years from now. And sure enough, in 1963, Dr. King marched in Washington, D.C. Lincoln had prophesied that somebody's ancestors were going to turn on somebody else's ancestor. This was a shocking thing to many people, because the 13th Amendment, or the abolishment of slavery, the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment, right to vote, Delaware was the last in line to ratify these 3 things. The abolition of slavery was never abolished in the state of Delaware, lost by 1 vote at one time. The dire anti-lynching law never passed Congress. These were the things that were beginning to let people think that perhaps Africans were 3/5 of a man. 3/5 of a man. All men are created equal. John is a black man. Is John equal to all other men in American society? This was a serious question that was coming about. The Civil War began to place racialism, as it was called formerly instead of racialism at the heart of the American psyche. Let's think about that. At the heart of the American psyche, American racism. The identity of an American. Who are we as Americans? We're considered, your nationality, we're all Americans. But then something occurs. American ethnic identity is viewed from various vantages. One is your racial composition. Are you Caucasoid, or you're Mongoloid, or you're Negroid? You're white, you're black, or you're yellow. Your ethnicity as an American. Then your faith comes into practice. Although America has no national religion, faith is a practice. Catholicism, Protestantism, Jewish, etc., that's another component of your ethnic identity in America. And let no one fool you. When you pass that ethnic identity, everybody's looking at your nation of origin. Where in the hell did you come from? That is very significant in American life and heritage. What boat did you come in on? We can joke about it and talk about, you know my people didn't come in on the Mayflower. See, skin color is a big factor here. I didn't come in on the Mayflower. Some of you can go down to the Blue Book in Washington, D.C., and your name won't be in there. My name will be in there. Newton is always in there. Newton is a very common name. I can be mistaken for being white. James Newton. How white can you get? I can go out in the Blue Book and they'll have Newton all over the Blue Book. But they're not talking about me. They're talking about someone else. The ethnic identity of American is critical to us all. It all goes right down to once you pass your nationality, once you pass your ethnic identity, once you pass your racial group, your religious connection, you're down to you. Who am I and what? See, in America, we think deductively. We don't invert it. When you think inductively, the big picture goes down to the small picture. But if you're a slave in America, you may think about self first. You may thought inductively. That's a very interesting point. The identity of American. Then our sociologists would tell us you have to assimilate in American society. Once the African American got here, he had to be assimilative. He had to speak the King's English, dress like others. This was not possible sometimes. The flag was always on the slave. His color was an outstanding factor. His position in society was an outstanding factor. That fact that he was hoping to be assimilated. To be assimilated into a society, you have to adopt the dress and the codes of the host society. In a way, America was the host to the slave. He didn't dress like them. We even have books called Black English. Them there, that there. See, your language becomes a factor. The way you dress becomes a factor. If you have a hat on your head, you're not becoming a part of the norm. You're not a part of American society. If the people are prejudiced against you, the absence of prejudice means that you're assimilated. The absence of discrimination means you're becoming assimilated. Wide-scale interracial marriage is a big factor in assimilation in American society. Widespread introduction to clubs. If you're the only one in a club and you're a token, that's not the process of assimilation. Wide-scale admittance to clubs. Wide-scale admittance to marriage. We see more of that on television than ever before. Black-white marriages. Had a student at the University of Delaware. I gave him an assignment. She was a young, beautiful black female, and he was a short, stubby white guy. And they would go to Wilmington. When he came back, he said, Dr. Newton, we turned a lot of heads. I guess you did turn a lot of heads. Because today, in today's world, you can walk into the Acme anywhere and see black-white couples, and nobody's turning a head today. It's almost commonplace. We're almost at the point of quasi-assimilation. Black students had going into other schools, integrated, etc. All of these things are a part of the racialistic society in which we live. I have taken a look at some of the elements that we look at, and I'm trying to move as quickly as possible to get the time frame right. The steps that we have to become assimilated in our society. Thurgood Marshall probably said it best. Black people can't assimilate. Everywhere they go, their skin color tells on them. Difficult to assimilate. Some groups never melted in the melting pot. Never melted in the melting pot. we have some similar things about Black-Jewish relations. This is my interpretation over time. Black-Jewish relations can be likened to a marriage, a sort of odd couple, always on the fringes of estrangement and divorce. Take a page from Booker T. Washington in 1896, when the Supreme Court had indicated you could be separate but equal in the society. Everyone knows what happened there, separate and unequal. Washington, in his 1896 Atlanta Compromise speech, and I take a paraphrase from that, I'm paraphrasing, we, Jewish Americans and blacks, we, when it comes to mutual respect, equality, justice, and discrimination, we are one like the fist. But in all mutual other concerns and issues, we are as separate as the fingers. This is a way of looking at the waning between black, white, and Jewish relations. Dr. King, Henry Louis Gates, the Harvard professor, the late Julian Bond, and other black leaders have spoken out about the mischaracterization of Jewish Americans. Mischaracterization. Others, such as James Baldwin, the author, Louis Farrakhan, have been critical of Jewish-black relations. Baldwin was critical because of the condition where he was. New York, and they stereotyped the Jewish vendors and the real estate men. A mischaracterization. That if you've ever been in a situation where you're a tenant, you're always ticked off or pissed off at the landowner. You didn't paint this, you didn't do that, you didn't take care of the commode. The roof is leaking. It's a damnedest situation you can get into. Baldwin was very key to that because he lived in New York. In times of trouble during modern civil rights struggles, Jewish and black Americans stood in the trenches to fight the good fight for the benefit of all humanity. Now, goodness is one of the keys. Goodness. Even in the diary of Anne Frank. Anne Frank says that despite everything that happened, there may some good come out of this. The diary of Anne Frank. Good. My mother said, James, she was a John Wesley Methodist follower all the way. Do all the good you can as long as you can do good. And I got so sick and tired of hearing that. When you're young, you get sick and tired of a lot of stuff that grown-ups say. I said, Mom, why do you always say, James, do all the good you can as long as you can do good? And I kept telling her, why do you say that all the time? And she said something very wittily, that there are people in this world who are going to spread all the hate they can as long as they can spread hate. She shut my mouth. She hit a nail on the head. You spread good as long as you can spread good to keep the hate from being spread by those who can spread hate as long as they can. My mother was a John Wesley Methodist all the way. Do all the good you can as long as you can do good. We find something else very interesting in racism. You have to have good leaders to eradicate racism. You have to have good leaders. And I'll comment on several leaders that really swung out to me. One was a man by the name of W.B. Du Bois, the Harvard scholar, black. who wrote one of the first books in the Harvard classics, The African Slave Trade. Professor Du Bois, as he preferred to be called, not Du Bois, Du Bois. Du Bois was a scholar. He ultimately came up with what he thought, and one of the founders of the NAACP, along with some Jewish colleagues, he came up with a theory called the double consciousness theory. And I'll read it for you. W.D. Bois and the double consciousness, and the theory of double consciousness. After the Egyptian, the Teuton, the Greek, and the Romans, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with a second sense in the American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness in America, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. W.B. Du Bois fought the good fight, anti-discrimination, anti-Semitism. He fought the good fight till the end of his life. He died on the same, I believe it's the same day that Dr. Martin Luther King was marching in 1963 March. So another person of great leadership, outside of being a premier scientist, Albert Einstein wrote in several humanistic journals. And I searched his journals out. What was Einstein talking about? He was talking about neighborliness. Albert Einstein's comments. Modern education is competitive, nationalistic, and separative. Modern education. It has trained we as students to regard material values as of major importance, to believe that one's nation is superior, that one's nation is superior. This is the general grounds for racialism, superior over others, superiority and inferiority. This is the ground for racialistic orientation, the groups that feel superior to others, grounded in the threads of racism. Einstein goes on to say that the general level of information is high, but usually biased, treating people differently, biased. Then he goes on to say that it's high, but usually biased, influenced by national prejudice, faulty generalizations about a group from others, faulty generalizations, serving to make us citizens of our nation, but not citizens of the world. That's Jim Einstein. And then one of our other leaders, Dr. King, in 1966. Many African Americans have been chided by others for taking the side of this group or that group, or seeing the whole picture. Dr. King at the Rabbinical Assembly Peace for Israel means security, and we must stand with all our might to protect its right to exist. Dr. King, a profound thinker and scholar. I see Israel as one of the greatest outposts of American democracy in the world. A desert land has been transformed into an oasis of brotherhood and democracy. This is why King, who catapulted the civil rights movement, the modern civil rights movement, and was one of the great securers of American democracy. King is given credit primarily because he upstood the principles of American democracy in the 20th century, which had long been surpassed by citizens who no longer were upholding the principles of American democracy. All men are created equal. Leadership creates limits on mischaracterization. Leadership. You have to have strong leaders. And King further goes another step. I look to a day when people will not be judged by the character by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. King was a messenger from God. There's no question. He had a message. And King led this message on as a leader of African Americans in the New World in the 20th century, aiding and abiding by the principles of American democracy. Most of you have probably seen the hate crime surges in the state of Delaware. This is alarming to many of us. Hate crime surges. 29 hate crimes, doubled from the previous year. Pennsylvania, 28% up. New Jersey, 97%. 14 race, ethnicity, and ancestry attacks. 14. You know how catastrophic one attack would be? We saw it in Pittsburgh. See? 8 religious belief attacks. 8. 6 sexual orientation. And 1 gender identity. This is the state of Delaware, a small state, and the numbers aren't grand like other states maybe, but this has happened in the state of Delaware. The Anti-Defamation League. Fight anti-Semitism, combat hate, secure justice, promote anti-biased education. All of these things are upon us today. The one thing we know that when troops rally, every so many years, things begin to get ugly again. You remember the old Westerns, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Let me sum up my results to the fact that today we still face racism in American society. We still need more people to fight these conditions, and we would hope that with groups such as this that we can begin to create some modification of what is taking place in America today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Newton, for that wonderful presentation. At this time, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Rabbi Michael Beals. Rabbi Beals has been with the congregation Beth Shalom since August of 2004. He is a 1997 graduate of the Jewish Theological Seminary. Rabbi Beals is also a graduate of the University of Judaism in Los Angeles, the American University in Washington, D.C., where he received an MA in International Relations, and the University of California at Berkeley, where he received a BA in Political Science. He received the Raoul Wallenberg Fellowship at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Beyond his accomplished education, Rabbi Beal has also worked in a variety of roles from serving as a management analyst, developing multicultural training programs, to working with young and old in programs of music therapy, Shabbat programming, and providing pastoral counseling and support to the sick and the elderly and to the families that support them. Please give a generous welcome and to the warm and caring humanitarian Rabbi Beals.
I'd be honest if I didn't say I'm really intimidated going after Dr. Newton. And so I feel like I'm the secondary act, and I won't be able to hold my own, but I'll do my very best. Before I begin my remarks, and rabbis always have this prelude. The clock is still ticking, but we think it's not, because we're going to do our prelude. So I know that there's a representative from Governor Carney's office. I'm very pleased because I respect you and the work that he does. I sit as the chair of the Governor's Delaware Council on Faith-Based Partnerships, which tries to create, since there's no National Conference of Christians and Jews anymore, this is like a successor organization. And since we know there's more than Jews and Christians out there, it tries to be as multi-religious as possible with Sikhs and Muslims and Hindus, and just to make it, of course, Catholics and Protestants. And I'm the token Jew. So anyway, please tell the governor I said hello. And who's there from Lisa Blunt Rochester's office? Where is this person? It's Diesta, hello. So I just saw Lisa a little while ago. I just came from Washington, D.C. And some of my experiences with Representative Blunt Rochester will be reflected in some of the later part of my conversation with you. I came from APAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Council, and I've attended a talk on intersectionality, especially to try to prepare for today, because I just want to make sure I gave you my best. So we shared some of our results with Representative Blunt Rochester. And then finally, Deborah Lipstadt. Oh boy, Deborah Lipstadt. So before I became a rabbi, I belonged to her synagogue in Los Angeles, and she was a real toughie. She's always been a real toughie. She fought against people who said the Holocaust never happened in England, and they made a movie about it. If you have to answer that, that's fine. It could be God, you never know. Or my wife, which is about the same thing. So when I was not yet a rabbinical student, I was a lay person in her minyan, in her group of people that prayed together, and I gave a sermon in front of her, and I was so scared. It was on the life of Sarah. Actually, Sarah has died by this point, and I was doing the whole biblical story based from Sarah's point of view. You know, I hear from Abraham's point of view, so I put on like a babushka little thing, and I retold everything from her. So it was a very pro-feminist take on the Bible, and she said, "That was good." So that's like, for Deborah Lipstadt, that is huge praise. And she paid my way to rabbinical school. So my take will be very different because I'm not a scholar. I'm just starting teaching at the University of Delaware. I'm in the middle of my first class teaching ever. So compared to Dr. I don't have to feel like such a newbie, such a greener. But I'll do my best. So I was given 6 questions to try to answer. So I'm going to try to stick to the questions. The first one was defining racism and anti-Semitism. So it's a hard thing to do. I take a more generalistic approach. I understand racism as to be prejudging people based on who gave birth to them. So for me, that's not only going to be African Americans, but it could affect Jews, it could affect Asians, it could affect Latinos. The idea that you would prejudge somebody, we'll say negatively, because of who their mother and father were, is a very generic definition of racism, and is a subset of racism. A smaller part would be anti-Semitism, prejudging people based on Jewish origin. You're going to see that's going to get a little complicated because I'm going to ask to be talking about the historical context. So history I know from. So I was trying to think where to begin anti-Semitism with you. And my first thought was the Jewish holiday of Purim just took place. So for those of you who are not familiar with Purim, it's basically the book of Esther. And you have to realize if I'm going to talk about any of this stuff, I'm going to have more of a rabbinic or biblical take because that's my training. And to try to do what Dr. Newton did would be disingenuous because I don't have the training or the background to do it. So from a rabbinic point of view, of course, the villain is Haman, who wanted to give boo for the Jews, and very well done, yes. Whenever you read Haman, you're supposed to blot out his name. And why? And this will get to my point, because I was looking at the first aspect of anti-Semitism in the world. And I wanted to start with his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, who was named Amalek. When the children of Israel were leaving Egypt, having just been freed, they were very vulnerable. And as people were just post-slaves, they didn't really know up from down, and they just had Moses to guide them. The women and the children were stragglers, and Amalek went after them. And there's no good reason given. They didn't do anything wrong. They didn't cross into Amalek's land. They didn't threaten them. They were just weak and vulnerable and prey. And we know that the bully is always there. In every generation, the rabbis say there will be Amalek who will come. Okay, that could be Amalek in this generation. Who can say? So I was going to start with Amalek, but then I thought I may have gotten ahead of myself because really Pharaoh, and this is something that both Dr. King and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, they were very close friends, and they both hyper-focused on Moses as a force for liberation. He was a central character that Jews and Christians could both get around in talking about liberation mentality. So it's Pharaoh who realized there's too many Jews around, and what should we do? This is a very xenophobic culture in Egypt, and so we have to kill the Israelite boys, and that will solve the problem. I think that's the beginning of anti-Semitism, if I could find you a place where it begins. And I would date it, if you need a date, 1200, let's call it 1600 before the Common Era. So now you have a date for anti-Semitism. So if you didn't learn anything else today from me, 1600 before the Common Era, 3600 years ago, first, and since we share the Bible, Jews, Christians, Muslims, so we have a common reference point. So we'll call it Pharaoh, which is funny because Pharaoh was probably a person of color too, but we were just different people of color. So that's the beginning of anti-Semitism. Now I'm going to go into tricky territory because I'm in a church, so I hope I get this all right. I hope I don't offend anybody. But really, anti-Semitism takes off when there's a new religion, right? And that will be Christianity. And when Christianity first begins, there's nothing anti-Semitic about Christianity. Christians are Jews. Jesus is Jewish. Jesus born a Jew, lived a Jew, died a Jew. His disciples were Jewish as well. So that doesn't come from there. It comes later. As the church tries to differentiate itself from Judaism, the Fourth Lateran Council started saying things like, Jews and Christians, they shouldn't break bread together. They shouldn't drink together. It could lead to mixed dancing. Moving along, rabbis shouldn't go ahead and bless the fields of Christian farmers, which means, I guess, they were. You have priests who are brand new. You have rabbis that have been at it for a while. Rabbis shouldn't do it. We'll move the Sabbath day from Saturday to Sunday, right? In Spanish, we still have a taste of it. Saturday is called sábado in Spanish, the Sabbath. Sunday, domingo, the day of our Lord. So all these separations begin to happen, and then the church begins to bring up the issue of deicide, that Jews are responsible for the death of God. Deicide. It's not in the original text of the New Testament. It comes later, and it's developed. If you want a good book on the subject, don't listen to me. Constantine's Sword is the definitive book by a former priest and scholar on the subject. He does much better than I do. But the moment you start accusing Jews of killing Jesus, things begin to change. And there becomes hostility and anger. And out of the Christian church comes two different options. One is destroy the Jew totally. And the other part is don't destroy him completely. Leave him in abject poverty and debasement so that this is what happens to rejectors of Jesus Christ. This is what they look like, as a warning. that begins what we'll have to call religious anti-Semitism. It's going to grow to its ugliest time during the Crusades in about the year 1000, circa, more or less, where Christian Europe, now there's no Protestantism yet, this is Catholicism, they decide that they want to free the Holy Land, which is Israel, right, of the infidel, which they say is the Muslim. But it turns out we've got infidel right here in Europe. We've got Jews. Why should we go ahead? Let's practice. We'll get rid of the infidels in Europe first, the Jews, and then we'll make our way to the Holy Land. And so Jews know terrible destruction. It's the second time we've experienced such bloodletting. The first was under Rome. Not only did Jesus die by the Romans, but many good rabbis died. In fact, we call it the First Reich. The Second Reich will be during the Crusades. And the Third Reich, is Hitler. And every time the Jewish position is dreadful. But I can't get to Hitler yet. I have to bring you to the Spanish Inquisition and expulsion. Jews were given the option that if they would only convert to Catholicism, they would be A-OK. So a lot of Jews did. In fact, the negative term for such Jews was called Marranos, swine eaters, because they would prove that they were now Christian by eating pork, which was forbidden to them. It's not the educated term. The correct term is conversos. But people still sometimes use the word Marranos, not realizing that it's really a disparaging term that Jews use for these new Christians. But get this, anti-Semitism has already become racial, because as new Christians, former Jews, tend to outdo old Christians, old Catholics in Spain, better at business, they begin to say, hey, their blood isn't pure. Their blood isn't really Christian. The moment you start bringing blood into it, we're talking about racism. Because at least before that, the Jew could convert, right, back to racism. They looked about the same color skin, so it's not an issue of skin color. That's why I wanted to give a broader definition of racism than only skin color. And later, in case I forget, think about Pudd'nhead Wilson, right? In the book by Mark Twain, Pudd'nhead Wilson, right? The boy that's born from the slave owner, the boy that's born of the housekeeper, they look exactly the same. So much so, the housekeeper can switch the babies, and nobody's going to know the difference. That's Mark Twain's satire on racism. Because as long as you're 124, it was some ridiculous percentage, right? That you're considered black. In Hitler's Germany, if one of your grandparents is Jewish, you're considered Jewish, right? So this idea of racial definitions gets me to my next stage. By the time we hit about the I have to go further. By the time we hit the 1800s, anti-Semitism is no longer religious-based, right? People aren't very religious at all anymore. Now it's emancipation and greater ideas, and Jews are involved more in the life of Europe. So they come up with a new definition, racial anti-Semitism. And everything you said before about the black race and the Asian race, and so the Jews are in big trouble, because we don't fit into anybody's categories. We're not black, we're not white, and we're not Asian. We're just like trouble. We're at the bottom of the racial totem pole. And we're considered very devious. And then there's certain issues about the race of the Jews. There's all science, that we're more deceptive and we're unscrupulous and we're very involved with business and all these things that aren't really racial stereotypes, they're behavioral stereotypes. But this becomes considered accepted science. And this is the foundations of Nazi Germany. This is where Jews find themselves being slaughtered along with African Americans, along with Gypsy, Roma, along with people with physical problems as well, all within this milieu, which is Hitlerism. I'm very worried about time, so I want to pick up where we are today if I can. So what's happening today? So craziness is happening today. But in terms of white nationalism, how are Jews and African Americans brought together into one icky mix? So it goes something like this. In Charlottesburg, they yelled that you will not replace us what were they talking about? I wasn't sure either. So this comes from my ADL meeting today, where we had a meeting on intersectionalism. And what was going on, they said, is that these folks in Virginia were saying that you Jews will not take African Americans, Latinos, and replace us whites with these folks. Not that the Jews would replace them, the Jews would be seen as a conduit. Why? Because it's been our MO. Our MO has been based on an ethical idea of tikkun olam, a repairing of the world. And wherever we've seen social injustice, we felt compelled to try to make it right, because that's part of the religious underpinning about what it means to be Jewish, is to try to make it right. And so that social justice piece can exist for Jews who never step foot in the synagogue, because Judaism is complicated. It's not just a religion, it's also a culture, it's a way of being, it's a people. For some people, it's just bagels, lox, and cream cheese. But underneath it all, there's just this compelling nature to try to make it right, which is why I think the Jewish-Black relationship has been so powerful. So what happened then in the Pittsburgh shooting? Right? Because it was not about African Americans, but think about what this synagogue was up to. This synagogue, and by the way, Congregation Beth Shalom in Wilmington is doing the same thing, so don't think I'm not scared. We're involved with HIAS, which was called the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society. It used to help Jews try to escape pogroms and really racist and religious-based anti-Semitism in Russia. But the Jews who needed to get out of Russia are now out. So what happened to HIAS? HIAS began to help other people in trouble as well. And so HIAS has been working with refugees who've been screened by the United States government for many years. They're completely kosher in every way. Whatever way you'd be a worried, xenophobic person, you don't need to worry. Our system of the State Department is so careful about people with refugee status. And this synagogue in Pittsburgh was helping folks who are refugees resettle. And this guy called Congregation Beth Shalom is doing through Jewish Family Services of Delaware, which is here in your county, as well as in my county as well. Well, this white racist, feeding all this time, saw Jews are added again. Jews are named, Jews are threatening the white purity of this nation by bringing in these unwanted people. And he was playing off of, and I don't want to get political, so I'm not going to judge it. I'm just going to present it. President Trump scaring people to say there's this caravan of people who are invading. It's an invasion. They're invading, and using this language, he created such hysterical behavior that this fellow who went shooting said, oh, I mustn't be invaded. I mustn't have my country invaded. I will shoot up those Jews who are enabling this invasion to happen. And that's the nexus of racism that you see today, and why African Americans and Jews are in the same boat. And listen, we're in the same boat a long time ago. Those big signs said, no Jews, we're on the no blacks, no dogs. My wife's a veterinarian, we like dogs. But all three, and I like blacks, and I certainly like Jews. Well, all three of us were the holy trinity of unwanted people in bathrooms and restaurants and hotels, etc. I think I want to stop here, if I can. Well, I have 5 minutes? Oh, lucky me. Okay. Fine. So I'll add only one piece. There's all these beautiful social action movements going on, the women's movement, and so many wonderful places where there's inequality, where Jews feel based on this idea of tikkun olam that they want to march side by side. So I will say that there is a group called BDS, Boycott, Divest, and Sanctions, created by Palestinians who are politically astute. And they really don't want to have a state of Israel at all. Not two states living side by side, which I'm in favor of, a state of Israel and a state of Palestine, with equal rights and equal balance. It's not what they're interested in. It's all about delegitimization. And they've made it so there's really no difference between hating Jewish people and hating the only Jewish state in the world. And it came up most recently with Representative Omar. And maybe I'll end there because it's so painful. So this is a woman and a Muslim representing Minnesota. Nothing I can be more excited about Minnesota. Very home companion, who doesn't like that? Minnesota, woman, more women in Congress, the better. Muslim, openly Muslim, thrilled. Somebody to break bread with, somebody to create alliances with. And she threw two things out there that will bring us back to Hitler. One is in terms of the support of Israel, she made this tweet. Now, why would she do a tweet when the guy in the White House tweets all the time? Tweeting is no way to communicate intelligently. If this was a big tweet, we'd be gone a long time ago. One shouldn't tweet, one should talk, face to face if possible. Tweeting is for birds. Tweeting doesn't get to nuances. It doesn't allow me to restate. It doesn't allow me to look at the pain in your eyes. By the way, I'm not so big on emails either. For praise, I like it. For neutral, let's meet. For coffee, good. For anything that's difficult or sensitive, we use our technology in the wrong way to hurt people. And it bothers me. It should bother you too. So Representative Omar tweeted about support for Israel in Congress, follow the Benjamin's baby. I heard a very clever retort today. Don't follow the Benjamin, follow David, King David, and David Ben-Gurion. Follow Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. Follow Jesus, Jesus, and Maria, and follow Muhammad. But you don't have to follow the Benjamins. The pun was that Benjamins are $100 bills. It had to be explained to me. And that the only reason why people in Congress would support Israel is because they're being bribed or manipulated to do so by money. It's an old charge to say that Jews manipulate the world by money. The only reason why we're associated with money at all is because the Catholic Church in its day wouldn't allow the Jews to do anything but money lending because it was considered such a disgusting thing for Christians to do that better let the Jews do it. Right up there with like cleaning the toilets. You'll do the money stuff because Jews, that's all you're good for. So that's the money bit. The other piece she said was, I will not pledge allegiance to Israel. I do not pledge allegiance to a foreign country. If to say that Jewish people can't be trusted because they have dual allegiances to Israel and to the United States. They can't be trusted. This is what Hitler said about the Jews as well. Your friends who had to leave Germany to come and thank God meet you were told that they could no longer be Germans because they were Jews. And some of the two were in conflict with each other. I love the state of Israel. I care about it. But I'm a loyal American, and I'm comfortable with the alliance. And am I comfortable with policies about Palestine? No, I want more for them. Of course I do. But don't confuse that with me being Jewish. They're two separate issues. And to mix them both together to say that somehow you can't trust me because I'm going to manipulate you by money, and you can't trust me because you never know which horse I'm really betting on. These are things that are really, we're beyond that. And it was sad that Representative Omar did that. That's how I experienced anti-Semitism today, and I wanted to clarify, I have to be up. I never like going over. I'm always worried because my congregants are always going like, or, so I'd rather be under. So let's hear questions.
Thank you, Rabbi Beal. At this time, we will begin our question and answer portion of the program. And here is the protocol for the procedure if you are new. You will step up to the mic, ask a question, address the question to either Rabbi Beals or Dr. Newton, then have a seat. Rabbi Beals or Dr. Newton will answer your question. There will be no follow-up questions asked. So the mic is here in the center of the floor. Feel free to come up and ask your question. And if there are several people asking questions, you just stand behind the person in front of you.
Thank God.
Hello, Sarah. Hi, Doctor. Hi, Rabbi. Do I have to ask specifically which one? Or can it be both?
Yes, they can both answer.
For both anti-racism and anti-Semitism, I'm Jewish, and I'm young, and a lot of people that are older than me, and younger, they don't like to admit systematic racism and things like that, anti-Semitism, what are ways that we can educate young folks and older?
All right. Okay, how do you educate? So, so Senator Coons said to me that what the rabbi's responsibility is to do is to create a background for people that most of the young people aren't quite sure what the Holocaust is. That Holocaust education is not mandatory in the state of Delaware, which I think is, to use a Yiddish word, a shanda. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen in Delaware, but it's catch as catch can. I used to serve at a state synagogue in West Virginia. West Virginia had mandatory Holocaust education at the state level. Delaware doesn't. Once we go ahead and educate about the Holocaust, then I think it's important to explain that had there been a state of Israel, 1939 to 1945, Jewish people would have had a home. There was an Evian conference in 1938, the year before the Holocaust happens, saying civilized countries come together. Who would like to take the Jews? The United States, we had quotas. We didn't want to take the Jews. Canada was part of England. They didn't want to take the Jews. Nobody wanted the Jews. The Dominican Republic said they would take the Jews. Maybe a few went. It's only after that that Hitler created the final solution. If nobody wants the Jews, well, we'll go ahead and we'll deal with it. We'll exterminate them because nobody wants it. We'll do the world a favor. I think only by connecting the dots and the fact that Israel's been in such a precarious situation do we get to maybe more educated conversation about the situation we find ourselves in today. So I think history is, I think Dr. Newton did that beautifully when he started to talk to you about how did African Americans come to this country in the first place. But I dare say that that's not clear either, the fact that they came in such a horrible, wretched situation against their own will. And maybe we could have added what was the civilization that they had in Africa, which many times was a very noble civilization, only to experience what they experienced here. All of that background is important, and I'm afraid that the younger generation, and with their now and email and quick and snappy chat, whatever, but they have no basis for history, so it's hard for them to make good judgment. In my rabbinical program, history was the underpinning of my training, and even as a poli-sci student at Berkeley, at American University, we always started with history. If you don't understand history, you are doomed to repeat it all over again.
One of the things I'd like to say is that education process, I was a student in Illinois, and Illinois had all students had to understand the dynamics of American society by the time they were in junior high school. They had to understand the role and contributions of all groups that make up American society. This was almost like a mandate at the state of Illinois, and I was shocked when I came to Delaware and saw no such activity. So as Black Studies Director, one of the things I tried to do was to establish with students that know who you are and where you came from. I learned from, like I mentioned, German philosophers who indicated to me that the only way they could get to America is know somebody with some higher connections and end up in Cuba with their new son and come to the United States. The irony was they had difficulty getting jobs. If you weren't Einstein, you couldn't go to Princeton. Well, what happened with some of these people was that they ended up in Illinois. They got 2 job offers, both from predominantly Black colleges. These were scholars of Plato and Aristotle and all that. The only job they got was historically Black college that I went to, North Carolina Central University, and Herman Nassy was able to teach German, philosophy, and other Romance languages, and I was one of his students, and I took all of his courses. The interesting thing was I ended up being as German as you can get. Primarily because they taught me philosophy. His wife taught me German. Then she was an art history person. She encouraged me to continue my art, and the one thing they said, if you have something to say, keep saying it. So the influence of people who And Dr. Manasseh went to Harvard and Yale, got offers from all of them, refused to go because he wanted to teach the young black students at the North Carolina Central University, of which I was one of his students. And if you look up his Ernst Moritz Manasseh, if you look him up on the internet, his whole biography and everything will be in German. It will be in German. And I found that amazing. And his wife was one story that I have to tell now is when I was taking German with Frau Manasseh, he came in one day and black students, not educated about the Holocaust, etc., put a swastika with chalk on the board. Frau Manasseh came in and got hysteric. And I could sprechen Sie Deutsch, and all I could say was, "Der liebe Gott, der liebe Gott, der liebe Gott." And I understood, and I saw that swastika. It was a shameful thing. A black student from that university college had put a swastika up there, and she had experienced the Holocaust. The result was that she tremored. They had to come in and pick her up. The whole time I had to talk to her in German, and she was shaking the whole time. And from that time on, she was never the same person. The education process. Education is the first rung in the ladder for people who come to America. If you are not educated, and this is the problem with the African American, of all the rungs, in 1740, the state of South Carolina processed a law that said it was against the law to teach a black person to read or write. And if a white person did it, they would be charged so many pounds. That education element went throughout the colonies at that time. It was against the law to teach a black person, a slave, to read or write. See, that's the problem with our process today. The first rung on the ladder of mobilization in American society is education. And the lack of that education, or a separate education, or a segregated education is not satisfiable. The Japanese refused to be educated in segregated classes. The Chinese were sent back to China because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. They were excluded from America because of, quote, coolie wages. The result is that the education process has become so ruinizing to black Americans that the scuffle was such that the elevation upward is still at the same level almost. Only a few may survive.
Hi, I'm so glad that you brought up Spain. My understanding was that, and I wanted to ask you about the political use of racism, because that's what happened in Spain, where Ferdinand and Isabella wanted to take over all of Spain. And the only way they could do that was to destroy the Mudéjar culture in the south, which was where the Jews and the Muslims were living in harmony and creating a really beautiful culture. So they turned the Christians against the Jews and the Muslims, and then in order to survive, the Jews and the Muslims turned against each other. Here in this country now, very cynical politicians who claim to be Christians, who really, I believe, couldn't care less about Christianity, are pitting blacks and Latinos against each other for survival on the lowest rung of the thing. And it's just Spain all over again. And I was wondering if you could comment on the dynamics between, and then they're all blaming the Jews, as they always do, but you know, so my civics teacher in junior high school was the most racist man I ever met. So.
Well, it sounds like you're referring to an issue of divide and conquer,
Exactly.
which is just such a shame. And I feel as a Jew and as a leader of a community, I feel like I have to constantly re-educate my congregation not to get too comfortable, because if I might quote a Protestant leader, which I'm sure you all know, Martin Niemöller, but let me paraphrase. He wrote in Germany, first they came for the trade unionists. I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came, he didn't use the word Roma. He said they came for the gypsies. I wasn't a gypsy. They came for the Jews. I wasn't a Jew. And down the list, and finally they came for me, and there's no one left to stand up for me. And I think that needs to operationalize everybody in the room, because no matter how you look at yourself, you all are a minority somewhere, right? Either as a devout Christian, perhaps, you're a minority among people who are trouncing Christianity. If you're an African American, I need not tell you. If you're Jewish, you get it, right? A lot of times people get really comfortable and say, well, they're not coming for me, so I'm gonna stay quiet. But, you know, I think we have to stay very, very vigilant. I know that Dr. Newton mentioned the Anti-Defamation League, and I understand they're next on your hit parade for people to come visit you. And I think you'll find them very useful, because early on out, they were looking not just for Jewish protection, but African American and other people who are vulnerable. Many of the points that you brought up, that the establishment will try to divide and conquer those people so that they do fight each other for limited resources, not realizing that the menace is something much more insidious, much larger. So I find your comments both very astute, both historically and contemporarily as well. And I congratulate you for your insights.
My Jewish great-great-grandfather.
Hi. I want to bring my question really down to Sussex County. My husband and I came down here permanently in 2004, and in 2005, all hell broke loose when two Jewish families brought a case against the Board of Education down here that there wasn't a separation of church and state. Coming from New York, I was like floored. And it made the daily papers, and the letters to the editors and stuff were horrific, saying, you don't belong here, go back, etc., etc. And you're talking about education, and it's not just the young, it's the old, and it doesn't seem to be, even after the ACLU had to get involved, even if it went to court, it doesn't seem to be any type of true recognition that there was problems, and or what have they done, or how are they going to educate, even in the classroom, even in churches, even wherever. And I'd just like you to, address it, because I find that Sussex County is very prejudiced between black, Jews, any minority, and you can tell by their voting patterns too. So I would like you to.
So I find that your issues are disturbing. I was just coming here to Delaware when this issue came up, and it shocked me as well coming from California. So I would say that I worry about religious insecurity, and why would any house of worship feel insecure by going ahead and imposing their views or theology on other people? So I'm just going to make myself vulnerable. I hope that's okay. So one of the most powerful religious organizations in Newcastle County is IMAG, right, which is our African American leaders together and of churches. And they asked me to come speak to them. And we're talking about the Dr. Martin Luther King celebration that we do each year, which is an IMAG-led event. And they wanted to know why wouldn't an interfaith organization be involved? And I said, well, listen, IMAG, their Dr. King event works very good as an ecumenical event, meaning that Catholics and Protestants, Christians of all flavors can be together. That's ecumenical. But I said it's not interfaith, because all of your prayers that you're offering are all ending in Jesus Christ's name. Now, I like Jesus very much. Good rabbi, good fellow, but I don't end my prayers in his name. I hopefully by ending my prayers in God's name, it's like I talk about subsets of racism, that racism is the big issue and that anti-Semitism is a subset. So theologically, I look at God as the broader set, and then we have different approaches, be it Allah or Jesus or just God in the case of Jews, etc. But people get very insecure, and if you don't do it their way. So my ministerial friends said, you know, we end our prayers in Jesus Christ's name, amen. I said, well, you can do that, but then you can't expect your Dr. King program to be interfaith. And it really shocked them. And I said, listen, I'm not telling you what to do at all. It's your program. But you had a Sunday service in the morning. Dr. King was brilliant because he could create alliances. So I said, what are the alliances you wish to create? But when you're in the majority, even when you're African American in a society that's mostly white, if it's all of you who are all the same, it's hard to see how are you different, how are you making other people feel uncomfortable. So using that whole experience and applying it to Sussex, I dare say the people that found, I think the Dobridges, what was the name of the family? Do you remember Dobridges?
There were two families.
Okay.
I know both.
Not important to mention the name.
They
Irrelevant.
moved away.
They moved away because it was uncomfortable. I think that they felt that these families were rocking the boat. This is how we do things. Don't be an upstart. Don't be impertinent. And sometimes you have to be sensitive to the culture that you're around and how much of a fight do you want to have. I, honest to God, would have moved away as well. I don't want to have that fight. There is something in Judaism called minchag hamakom. What is the custom of the place? And sometimes you have to respect the custom of the place and say, my customs don't fit well here. Or sometimes you have to decide if you want to have the fight or not. I'm a lover, not a fighter. I will finally say that I think the answer to your question begins in the houses of worship of Sussex County. They control the culture and what the parishioners might think or say. And I think that's where you begin a cultural shift. I don't think in a case like this, it starts with your legislators. You can't legislate tolerance. You can't legislate cultural understanding. So I think something like this, right, is your holy seed, your apple, your Johnny Appleseed. But how do you begin to change the culture so that it's safe for everybody? So I congratulate all of you. You are cultural transformers by sitting in this room this evening.
Hi, I'm Shelley Grable, and a nice Jew from Brooklyn. So I've had some similar experiences coming here, but I also grew up in the civil rights movement and in a lot of political activities around human rights and social justice. And what concerns me, just something you talked about before, is that when I was growing up, there was a strong alliance between Jews and African Americans. There's been a lot of work to break that down, and that, I think, is deadly. So I'm hoping that we can find ways to bring that alliance back to a strong place, because alone we're not going to make it.
One of the things that history shows is that the alliances seem to grow when the pot is about to bubble over, that they tend to pull together in times of struggle and strife. The result is that once the kind of dust has cleared, the alliances tend to splinter out. The result being that we have to be very, very vigilant about alliances and groups that put things together. For instance, an example would be the Southern Christian Leadership Conference started by King and others. That alliance really was the real stronghold for the civil rights movement. The result being is that we began to attract not only Christians and others, but King was very deliberate upon assuring that the Christian and Jewish brothers would join this group. The result was that they joined, but without that kind of leadership from Dr. King and or others, it does not resume itself. It takes, believe it or not, young people who are beyond certain things have to take up some of this slack and begin to evolve as a new leadership council. The reason I say that is because we older folks tend to think about things of the past. It'd be like my daughter introducing me to hip hop and rap music. I'm old school doo-wop. If you understand what I'm saying. And so we elderly, we tend to stick with our tradition. Now tradition, young people can't start a tradition, but they can continue one. This is what we're looking for. Young people have to take up the reins. Young people have, like my grandfather said, you still got some dues to pay, boy. You still have some dues to pay. Young people have lived a good life, I would call it. In college, they lived a good life. They party. Partying is fine. It has its time and place. But at some point in time, let's get to the real issues. The real issues. What they call it, I was reading at one time, if you ever read the National Census, you can read the National Survey of Jewish Family Income. And what you end up with is something that mischaracterizes Jewish people. They're always at the top of the line. This is mischaracterization. At the bottom of the line, guess what two figures are there? The Native American who was here before all of us, and Black Americans. Can you imagine that? 100% Family Income Index will show Jewish Americans first in the 1970s. The Chinese were next. And then we get other groups. And guess who's at the bottom? The same people we call minorities today. Guess who's in the middle? White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. You have to understand this to understand the American system. That family income indexes tells us something. If you want to look at the index today, American Indians still down at the bottom. Blacks and Latinos. And notice the incoming of immigrants. Blacks and Latinos. Latinos are now, Puerto Ricans were ahead of blacks. Filipinos were ahead of blacks. But the top area has never, hardly ever changed. The only change that we find more recently, believe it or not, is Asian Indians. You see them, don't you? The places that used to be the 7-Elevens, the gas stations. You see them. Guess what? I'm not going to tell you where they are now, but they're moving up. You heard that comedy, moving on up? Well, they're moving up.
Thank you.
But guess who's staying at the same level?
Dr. Newton,
Yes.
we have time for one more question.
Okay.
Before you do, just very quickly, in terms of hope, so I think we have to be sensitive to each other's pain. And so, for example, when the Trayvon Martin case was decided and what was his name? Zimmerman was found. Okay. So I went to an hour of power at our African American church, our AME church. Some of my congregants who were lawyers said, but no rabbi that came up with a, how can you be against? I said, you misunderstand me. I'm not talking legalese. The African American community in Wilmington is in pain, and I represent both the Jewish community and I'm white. I need to be where they need me to be. That began a tradition, at least in Newcastle County, where we've been there for each other. So when the JCC was multiply threatened by bombing, the African American community was there and a Muslim community was there. And we've been added ever since when the ban went, the Muslim ban went, the African community and the Jewish community, we went over to the Mosque of the Islamic Society of Delaware. Under this current administration, we've become so mobile. I mean, our current president created so many opportunities for goodness. Instead of shaking our finger and yelling at him, which is so easy to do and doesn't require any energy, we've created maybe a new alliance, taking on Dr. Newton's challenge about getting out of our chairs and going to other people's houses of worship and saying, you do not need to stand alone. And if I was going to give you any hope, and as a rabbi, I think that's my job to do, I want to empower you to try to go where the pain is. Just not, even if you disagree with the decision illegally, be empathetic. How is that group feeling? And if they're feeling alienated, if they're feeling like the odds are against them, you, especially if you're of a different color or a different religion, you have more power and energy to do good by your differences than you would if you were the same color. So I think you could leverage race to do good if you put your heart and soul into the moccasins shoes of another person. And so I hope I empower you to be more empathetic and move your opinions.
Hi, thank you both so much for coming. My name's Megan. I'm actually a recent graduate of UD, and I honestly wish I would have taken your class at the time. And I've been trying to make up for it since. The only, I guess, African American history I had in class had to do with George Washington Carver, sadly. I wanted to also thank for the question before, because my question has to do about the definition of racism. Racism in the US has a very unique, it's formed around whiteness, as you've talked about, so much so that when we talk about Jesus, I'm sure all of us picture in our heads a very transparent white male, when we know more and more that that's not true. So this whiteness is very pervasive, and I wanted to talk more about systemic racism and how, when I also look around, I see a lot of white people, and there's this idea of a post-racial society. So getting to my question, I think the work has to dismantle systemic racism has to come from white people, and we have to do it with each other, and it can't just be, with black people as well. So what's the difference between being non-racist and anti-racist? And if you could speak to more of why that's so important in the society today.
Actually, I'm going to answer that question.
Okay.
Maybe I'm not. Let's see. Tonight, I stand before you as a moderator, but I am also a racial microaggression consultant. That's a lot of words. And I've been asked to speak about it for a few minutes and how it affects people of color. Racial microaggressions have dominated the media, if you're on websites, blogs, newspapers, and news programs, over the past decade, and continue to do so today. However, some may argue that the issues regarding racism, implicit bias or unconscious bias, racial inequality, and racial microaggressions are nothing new. The word racial microaggressions was first coined in the 1970s by Dr. Chester M. Pierce, an African-American professor of education and psychiatry at Harvard University. He described microaggressions as demeaning implications and other subtle insults against minorities. The concept has then been expanded by other leading psychologists and scholars today. Dr. Darrell Wing Sue of Columbia University continues the work of Dr. Chester Pierce and is one of the leading psychologists in the field of racial microaggressions today. Dr. Sue defines microaggressions as brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, and negative insults and slights to the targeted group or person. Microaggressions can be so pervasive and automatic in daily interactions that they are considered innocent or harmless. However, research has shown that experiencing a racial microaggression or a microaggression can be detrimental to the person's psychological health, mental health, and physical health, and can lead to chronic stress, depression, anxiety, and lower self-esteem. In 2007, Dr. Sue expanded this definition even further by including aggression towards marginalized groups, such as women, LGBTQ individuals, religious and disability groups. It is important to acknowledge the other types of microaggressions. However, due to the lack of time, tonight we will focus strictly on racial microaggressions. Here are a few examples of racial microaggressions and the hidden message they send to people of color. I provided handouts in the back of the room, or maybe you have them now, should you want to study and understand it further. The first one is an example. You are a credit to your race. The hidden message is that people of color are generally not as intelligent as whites. Here's the second one. You are so articulate. The hidden message, it is unusual for someone of your race to be intelligent. Picture this scene, picture this scenario. A white man or woman clutching their purse or checking their wallet as a black person approaches or passes by. How about this one? A store owner following a customer of color around the store. How about this one? A white person waits to ride the next elevator when the door opens and there is a person of color. These behaviors carry hidden messages to people of color. The message is, you are presumed a criminal, you're going to steal, you are dangerous. Another familiar scenario is having a taxi cab pass a person of color and pick up a white passenger instead. If you're from New York, you know that's true. The hidden message is, you are likely to cause trouble, or I may have to travel to a dangerous neighborhood. Another example is being ignored at the store counter as attention is given to the white customer behind you. And of course, the familiar expression, you people. The hidden message here is people who belong to the dominant culture are more valued customers than people of color. People of color are second-class citizens. And here's the last one. A black couple is seated at a table in the restaurant next to the kitchen, despite there being other empty tables and more desirable tables located near the front. The hidden message, you are a second-class citizen and undeserving of first-class treatment. So, how do racial microaggressions affect people of color? While some people may believe that racial microaggressions are brief and harmless, many studies have found that racial microaggressions have a significant negative impact on people of color's mental and physical health. For instance, a recent study has found that the more racial microaggressions people of color experience, the more likely they are to also report depressive symptoms and a negative view of the world. Another study reported that when people of color experienced racial microaggressions, they felt depressed, anxious, and even traumatized. Two other studies found a relationship between racial microaggressions and intense psychological distress. So, should I respond to a racial microaggression? What are you supposed to do when you are the victim of a racial microaggression? In an article on racial microaggression, Sue and colleagues discussed the catch-22 that people of color experience when they witness or are the recipient of racial microaggressions. And this is how it goes. First, I may question if a racial microaggression actually occurred. Did I hear him correctly when he made that comment? If I perceive the racial microaggression did occur, I may ponder the potential risks and consequences of responding or not responding. Here are some questions I might ask myself in that moment. Well, If I respond, could my physical safety be in danger? If I respond, will the person become defensive and will lead to a huge argument? If I respond, how will this affect my relationship if this is a coworker, a superior, a family member? But if I don't respond, will I regret not saying anything, leaving feeling angry, guilty, or disappointed in myself? If I don't respond, does that convey that I accept the microaggressive behavior or comment? So you can see the process of deciding how to respond in the moment to the racial microaggression can in itself be stressful. So how should you respond to racial microaggressions? If you decide to take an action, you must contemplate how to react. First, you can approach the situation in a passive-aggressive way. For instance, perhaps you made a joke or a sarcastic comment as a way of communicating that you are very upset and annoyed. Or perhaps you do the eye-rolling thing, or the heavy sighing thing. Or you do nothing in the moment and decide to talk to others who know the aggressor in hopes that your dissatisfaction will get back to them. This might be effective when you simply do not have the energy to engage in the perpetrator in this moment. Sometimes you have experienced racial microaggressions so often you may feel so agitated that you just want to scream. Other times, a more active response may be a therapeutic way of releasing years of accumulated anger and disappointment. Here are a couple examples. The real simple one is 3 simple questions you might want to ask. What do you mean by that? Why would you say something like that? And the third one, what point are you trying to make by saying that? Those are easy. But if you really want to go a little deeper, here are some other strategies. Use the I statement. I felt hurt when you said that. Instead of attacking the person, tell them your feelings. Paraphrase or repeat back what you said. Restating their comment clarifies it for you and also for them. They actually can hear how that statement sounds. Play dumb. Even if you understand what they're saying, pretend that you don't and ask them to explain. It forces them to think about what they just said. Give information or alternative perspectives. For instance, offer facts to correct or challenge the assumptions that they are making. Or flatter them. Tell them they're too smart or too good to say things like that. When someone says something that you doubt the person really believes, or at least doesn't hold strongly, you can say, you're too smart to say something like that. And finally, express your feelings. Tell the person how you feel, and if possible, explain why you're offended and why you are uncomfortable. Now, when the entire interaction is over, it's important that you seek support, any kind of support. You can also seek social support, like you can talk to your loved ones about what just happened, or other people who have similar identities and who can validate your experience. That is key. You need validation that you are okay. Processing your emotions is so important because racial microaggressions, and I can't emphasize this enough, have been known to lead to an array of mental and physical health problems. As mentioned before, depression, anxiety, and trauma. In doing so, you may avoid accumulating negative feelings that may affect you for the rest of your life. So everyone, please, join me in standing up and speaking out against all microaggressions, gender microaggressions, racial microaggressions, sexual orientation microaggressions, people with disability microaggressions, religious microaggressions. Stand up and speak up for your children. Stand up and speak up for your grandchildren. Stand up and speak up for yourself. If you don't speak up, you're surrendering a part of yourself. You're letting racism win. Thank you. So where do we go from here? Tonight you have heard from two remarkable gentlemen, and now it is time to ask ourselves, how do we move the conversation forward? I am pleased to tell you that one way to heal together as a community and make a positive change is to sign up for the Dialogue to Action program. Dialogue to Action groups are a diverse group of 8 to 12 people that meet 6 times, along with diverse facilitators, to hold focused discussions where personal experiences and perceptions are openly shared about issues of concern surrounding differing races, religions, and cultures. The YWCA sponsors these groups. Their goals are to improve the understanding and acceptance of differing races and cultures and religions throughout Delaware, and to provide the community with practical recommendations for such organizations, institutions, and individuals can take to improve racial relations and racial equality. You'll find the sign-up sheet in the back of the room. In closing, I would like to thank our guest speakers, Dr. Newton, Rabbi Beals, our organizer, Charlotte King of the Southern Delaware Alliance of Racial Justice, the Women's March of Sussex County, Delaware Humanities, Seaside Jewish Community, and for the hospitality of Bishop Jones of the Trinity Faith Christian Center, and to you, all of you, for attending tonight's most insightful presentation. Good night.
Allow us to meet at their building almost weekly soon to plan this during their work hours. So if you're here, anyone from Jewish Family Service, thank you very much for allowing us.